I have always loved Christmas. I love all the traditions and family gatherings and stories and the music, the lights. I especially love the season of Advent, leading up to our celebration of Christ's birth. But I never fully appreciated Christmas until I understood its actual history. So today, since this is the last video we'll post before Christmas, I want to give you a bit of a history lesson. Let me start with something that many of you probably know. Most of our modern Christmas traditions come from pagan rituals. Scholars believe that Constantine blended Christian traditions and pagan ones in order to unify his empire. This included setting a date for celebrating Christ's birth in December to coincide with winter festivals. In the years since, Christmas traditions have been added and adopted from many cultures and places. Mistletoe is a parasitic plant that attaches itself to trees. Scandinavians connected it with the goddess of love. Trees were used by the Romans as a way to celebrate winter solstice, but lights didn't appear on trees until the 1800s. In Germany, tinsel became popular based on a legend about a poor woman whose tree was covered in spider webs. The Christ child felt so much compassion for her that he turned those webs to silver. We could go on and on, looking at Santa Claus and gift giving, and many of the other traditions we practice around this time of year. I think it's safe to say that Christmas is a bit more diverse than most of us think it is. All this history is fascinating, but my favorite piece of Christmas history has nothing to do with pagan traditions. You've most likely heard before that Jesus wasn't born in December, and that's true. The rabbis say that Jesus was probably born during Sukkot, better known as the Feast of Tabernacles. This is one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals where Hebrews would travel from wherever they lived to celebrate the harvest. This happens between the months of September and October. To celebrate this festival, each family builds a sukkah, a temporary shelter to live in for the 7 days of the festival. This booth is made from natural materials with open sides and a roof covered in palm branches. When you sit inside, you are reminded how vulnerable you are to the dangers in the outside world. And you realize, living in this open-sided structure for 7 days, that your security comes from God alone, because this shelter won't get it done. Israel lived in these kinds of shelters in the wilderness. Sukkot festival recalls that experience and celebrates God's provision, protection, and providence. God is a very symbolic God. He wants to paint pictures for his people to make sure that they get it. I think he sends his son on Sukkot because he wants us to understand what he is doing in and through this Messiah. And it's such a great picture. Just like all the Jews celebrating Sukkot, Jesus is born into a temporary shelter, a stable. He literally moves into the neighborhood and is completely vulnerable to the world and the evil within it. He's totally dependent on God. This vulnerability allows Jesus to tabernacle or dwell among his people. And Jesus also becomes God's provision for our salvation. During this celebration of vulnerability, Jesus is a reminder of God's protection. He comes to save us from the curse of death. He saves us because we can't save ourselves. He is our security as we sit exposed in the wilderness. Then there's one last part of the picture. But to see it, you need to know a bit more about Sukkot. One of the greatest events that happened at Sukkot every year was the worship. Every day, part of that worship involved dancing around the altar of God with palm branches. The priests would get water from the pool of Siloam and pour it on the altar. And they would sing the song, "Glory to God in the highest," and celebrate their God. But there was an ulterior motive. They hoped to bring God's river, promised in Ezekiel. In Ezekiel's vision, that river begins at the temple and flows east into the wilderness, growing in width and depth and creating life wherever it flows. The Israelites knew that God had promised a Messiah who would come and bring that kind of life to God's people. And so they danced and sang for 7 days, trying to bring God's river, crying out for God's Messiah to come. On the 7th day of the feast, they would pour water on the altar 7 times and sing even more loudly while they danced around the altar, hoping that God would respond and fulfill his promise to dwell among them. These people longed for God to break into their world. And through Jesus, God literally did. right in the middle of the Sukkot festival. If our Christmas celebrations today are about anything, they're about that same longing. People live without security, without protection, lacking provision. Like Israel, we know how vulnerable we really are. In response, God offers us a baby. He offers himself, just as vulnerable as everyone else. But he also offers a promise of protection and salvation. This Christmas, will you join the ancient Israelites and cry out to God? Will you ask him to come into your world in new and tangible ways? If you do, it will satisfy the deepest longing of any human heart and step into the ancient and most significant tradition of Christmas, God breaking in and dwelling among us.